So welcome everyone. I have a little prologue before my presentation starts, and it's kind of related to my talk, and it might sound familiar. The world is changed. I feel it in the sandbox. I feel it in the entitlements. I smell it in the kernel. Much that once was is lost. Only a few live now who remember it. It began with the forging of the great privacy rules. 3 were given to the root user, immortal, wisest, fairest of all beings, great people and clients of the Apple spaceship. And 9 rules were gifted to Apple processes which above all else desire power. For within these rules was bound the strength and will to govern privacy. But they were all of them deceived. For another rule was made. In the land of Cupertino, in the fires of Intel CPUs, the dark Lord Privacy forged in secret a master rule to control all others. And into this rule, he put his will to dominate all processes. One rule to rule them all. One by one, the freelance of macOS fell to the power of the rule. But there were some who resisted. The last alliance of legacy software, disabled library validation, and bug hunters marched against the armies of TCC. And on the slopes of El Capitan, they fought for the freedom of macOS. So, with that, let me start my presentation about the Achilles heel of endpoint security, which is in secret a TCC talk at the end, and we will see why and how it's related to privacy. So a few words about myself. I'm currently working at Offensive Security, and I'm the lead content developer for our macOS control bypasses training. I used to be a red and blue teamer. I do macOS bug hunting in my free time. I'm married, have 2 kids, and I really like to do trail running. So if you follow me for macOS stuff, you will notice that I'm using Twitter as Instagram for running. So I will briefly talk about the endpoint security framework, then briefly talk about how we install an endpoint security client, and then we'll start to go through various, first a CVE, and then we will see how Apple fixed it, how I bypassed it, how they fixed it again, how I bypassed it again, and ultimately the story went on, and we will see how this whole story evolved into something. And at the very end, I will talk about the full disk access. So endpoint security, just a really brief overview. Scott Knight gave a very good OBTS talk a couple of years ago, reviewing the entire framework. It has many, many building blocks. It has a kernel extension as a base, which is tied to the the mandatory access control framework. Then obviously it has a client-side API, a DILib, the lib endpoint security DILib, which we can use from our endpoint security client. There is also the system extension framework, which is basically used for installing and uninstalling a system extension. We don't have to use that. It's really only in the case if our endpoint security client runs as a system extension. And then there is the sysxd, the system extension daemon, which is used for verifying and installing the system extension. And then we have the endpoint security daemon that can load the system extension using launchd. And we also have the system extension CTL, which can be used for some basic controls of the system extension, although it's very basic. Like you cannot remove a system extension or anything like that, or at least on Monterey it didn't work. Endpoint security basically has a very tight relationship with the Mac framework. It has, I think, about 100 hooks these days, and they are kind of mapped out to user mode. So all the events you can sign up for in user mode, like the ES event type notify ch root, they have an equivalent hook in kernel space, and basically they are tied together. This is like a very simplified view of this. And I think it's really powerful because the Mac framework was never officially supported by Apple for third parties, although many people use that. It was not supported, and we kind of get it now in user mode. And I think it's really powerful and a great framework. So how we install a client? The one crucial thing for any system extension or any endpoint security client is that they have to have full disk access permissions. So that means that we open system preferences, go to privacy, unlock privacy, and then finally grant full disk access permission to these applications. So it's very user interaction heavy. And I understand why, because it's a very powerful thing to have to run endpoint security application. So it can do really anything on our system. So it's understandable that there is a control behind that. And if you are not providing this permission to the endpoint security client, it will throw an ES new client result are not permitted error, and basically it cannot register itself. So for example, if we run the process monitor from terminal, and if terminal doesn't have full disk access, it will throw this error, which again basically means that it lacks TCC permission. Now, if we revoke this permission, like the full disk access, the client this permission should be hard as well, because if you can easily revoke it, then basically you can easily disable and disarm any security software on the system. So it should be hard, right? Turned out that it wasn't that hard. So this is the exploit for the for the first CV. So let's see what happens here. So the user went through all this authentication, opening system preferences and everything, and finally he's happy running his endpoint security client, and then the attacker comes as a user, like it doesn't have to be root, and runs this command, and suddenly everything is cleared, the permission is revoked, and if the attacker kills the endpoint security client, then it's done, basically, bypassed. So you might think that, like, killing the endpoint security client, you will need to have root access, but as we heard many times from Wojciech yesterday, you can just ask the client, like, hey, prompt your password to authenticate, and the client, the user will happily authenticate. We can also find an ODA to elevate our privileges. So there are so many options, or if we delivered our malware through a package, which can run as root often, then we are already root anyway. So I think having root is not, it's a barrier, but not as high as we think about it. So how Apple fixed this reset option? Okay, they said that, okay, if you now want to reset an endpoint, a full disk access permission for an endpoint security client, we need you to authorize it. So they prompt you for a password. And if you don't authenticate, then it will not work. So it will not clear the TCC database. It will not clear the permission. It wasn't eligible for a bounty, unfortunately. So let's see how I bypassed it for the first time. So how this authorization happens really in tccutil? So tccutil went on and wanted to acquire the com apple tccutil.admin authorization right. And if we check this authorization right in the authorization database, we will see that it's authenticate admin non-shared. So basically, even if you are root, you will be forced to authenticate as an admin user, and you will have to type your password to authenticate, which is fine. But what if we are root? If we are root already, we can, and we assume that we are root because we need to kill the endpoint security client, we can just edit the database. Like if your authorization database is not protected by anything, if you are root, you can change it freely as much as you want. So we just edit the rule and say hello. And then we go back to tccutil and reset and done. Ineligible for a bound. Even more unfortunate, because I really hardly working on this. So how they fix the authorization problem? You can bypass it if there is no authorization. To be fair, you need to have something else now. So authorization is gone, like completely gone. Now you need to have full disk access permission for terminal or from wherever you run tccutil to reset this right. So interestingly, there is an interesting thing here. How tccutil knows which application has full disk access granted. It can read the TCC database. So it has a com apple private TCC manager access read entitlement, which specifically permitting it to read who has full disk access permission. Now, if you are Apple, you can do that. If you are not, you need to read Cedric's post about how you find out if you have full disk access or not. You need to do some trickery there. There was also an interesting bug in tccutil. So what tccutil will do is we'll try to reset every entry line by line. And if it fails to do it, because maybe it doesn't have full disk access right, it will fail out and exit. So basically, if you don't provide it the necessary rights, it might fail clearing other entries as well if it fails right away with an endpoint security client. So this was a fix Apple did. They changed now, we will see at the end. But until 2 days ago, I thought that this is the final fix. But how we can still bypass this whole concept? I go back to one of my favorite things, tricks mounting. So how does tccutil know that an application an application from the TCC database is an endpoint security client? Like, there is no entry related to that in the database at all. So what it needs to do is go read the binary from the disk and check if it has the com apple developer endpoint security client entitlement, which means that in that case, it's an endpoint security client. So what we can do is mount over the endpoint security client directory, which we can typically do unless it has some self-protection. We mount over, we mask out the endpoint security client, and then we run tccutil reset. And because it will not find the file, it will think that, okay, it's not an endpoint security client, and it will basically clear the database. I don't know yet. Please. So another bypass for this whole idea. So tccutil already went through several evolutions, and there are a lot of fixes in that. What we can do, and it worked on Ventura Beta 5 as well, get an old tccutil, and use that. Because old tccutil could still clear the database, and it didn't have any of the checks for full disk access, authorization, whatever. So just take an old one from Big Sur and use that. So here we can see on the screen that we have two tccuTils, one the system default and one I took from Big Sur. The system default will not work, but the other one will. MFI, the Apple Mobile File Integrity kernel extension, already has some limitation for which tccutil you can run on macOS, but it wasn't perfect. So it's still, for some reason, I didn't dig into why, you could still run the one from Big Sur. Don't know, please. So finally, and this is new stuff. So 2 days ago, I got a notification from Apple that, hey, you want to check our latest beta? We fixed everything. And I mean, thank you. It's a very last-minute addition to my talk. And I was like, but what did you did exactly? Like, OK, you fixed it, but I mean, in 2 days, it's hard to find what you did and talk about. Luckily, they helped out with some stuff, so I can dig it a little. Hopefully, it's a really good fix now. At least it looks like that. So, but before I go into the fix, there is also an unintentional fix or protection in Ventura. So in Ventura, TCC has a new protection. It will protect applications from other applications. So your application cannot modify an existing application on the system. So if you try to drop a file or overwrite a file in another application, you need to have a new TCC permission for that. Specifically, this TCC service system policy app bundles permission. And if you don't have that, you cannot modify an application. This includes mounting over an application. So it kind of solves this mount issue unintentionally. So this wasn't a fix for this specific issue. This was a new security mitigation in Monterey. And it kind of already prevented one of the bypasses. So it protects the ES clients from messing around. But what the real fix was, like from 2 days ago, what happened? tccutil is back to square one. So it's right there where it started from. And now the entire clear or reset logic was moved to the TCC daemon. So tccutil doesn't do anything anymore, just calling an API, and then tccd will determine what can be reset, what not, and it will do all the checks. What the other thing they did, now we have a new TCC permission called the kTCCServiceEndpoint Security Client. So this means that this is a new TCC permission marking in the TCC database that this application is an endpoint security client, which is nice because it no longer needs to read it from a disk. Now, interestingly, if we go to system preferences and privacy, this is still under full disk access. So there is some magic happening behind the scenes. So the users still see it as a full disk access. But if it's provided for an endpoint security client in the database, it will show up as an endpoint security client. Since there is some translation happening here, I always fear that there is a room for error in this situation, but I hope they get it right. Also, if you have an endpoint security client which runs from the command line, you still grant full disk access for like terminal, and then you can run your endpoint security client. And in that case, it doesn't have an endpoint security client permission. So this is how it's fixed eventually. I think it mitigates all of the issues at this point. We will see. But when I found the very first CV, when it all started, so I said tccutil reset all. So that worked. But if I tried tccutil reset system policy all files, which is full disk access, it didn't work. So someone already talked about this problem that maybe you shouldn't reset or clear endpoint security permissions so easily. And actually I started to go back, okay, when this was really introduced, and I think I found it in Catalina, like 15.4, where I think it was the first version where it wasn't working. But if we go back to the very first edition of Catalina, so like the first release, you could do tccutil reset system policy all files there. So somewhere in between, someone thought about this, that, hey, this is an issue and we should do something about it. So that's when the really first issue was fixed, not properly, but it came up. So how tccutil evolved over time? In Catalina, when basically endpoint security came out, tccutil had no restrictions. Then at 15.4, tccutil started to limit the use of the system policy all file commands. And then from Monterey, it started to limit both the all and the system policy all files part with authorization. From 12.3, the same, but now with the full disk access requirement. And now with Ventura, the logic is moved back to moved to TCCD, and there are new TCC permissions for ES clients. So I think this was a nice story here with tccutil. I also want to talk about full disk access a little bit. It's really becoming one of the absolute power, the ultimate, the rule, or, well, it's not a rule, it's a permission. But it's really a master permission when it comes to not just TCC, but everything else. So what it controls today, and this might be not a complete list, this is what I know about, it might be much more. So it controls full access to the TCC database, at least for the user mode, but if you have full disk access, you can also read the system-wide database. In general, it provides you full access to every private file of the user. It controls, now partially, the Endpoint Security Client registration. It controls the ability to mount an APFS snapshot. It controls access to some of the data vaults on the system. And it also controls access to like system administration config files like sudo, PAM. Like if you want to change a sudo file or a PAM file, you will get a TCC prompt that, hey, do you let, I don't know, terminal modify your system administration settings or something like that. If you have full disk access, this prompt is gone. So it's way too powerful, and it's not, but it really feels like a lightweight SIP, but for user mode, what the user can like turn on and off easily. And because of it controlling so many things, I think this is bad, because for convenience, people, especially power users, will just say, okay, I will give terminal full disk access and I'm done, and I don't want to deal with all these prompts, all these permissions, whatever. And depending on the application, having full disk access, you might be easily inject code into the application. Like with terminal, it's really easy. You just edit the ZSH RC file, or create a terminal script or whatever, and at that point you run commands in the context of terminal, and you inherit its, all of its permissions, and you get full disk access. I think a much better way would be to make more granular rules. So all of this should be split up to different rules or permissions. And I also think the TCC database should be moved under full SIP protection. So like having full disk access, allowing us to completely controlling this database, it's just bad. So, and it probably should be only the TCC daemon who can modify that file at that point. I also think that anyone could read the database. Like the only risk there is really just some enumeration. You know what's on the system, but there is really no security implications there with reading the database. So that could be actually allowed. That was it. Thank you. Any questions?
What happens if you delete the TCC database? Can you repeat the question for the vice?
So the question was, what happens if I delete the TCC database? Nothing. It will be recreated, I think. So yes. Yes. But normally you cannot access the database unless you have full disk access.
How does this affect MDM delivered permissions to TCC database? So can you reset it out from underneath the MDM control and still persist that? And still triple it?
That's a good question. I never dealt with MDM delivered TCC permissions, so I don't know what happens if you run this command. With since MDM permission, I think they are installed through a profile. I think that profile might be reapplied, and so it's not being cleared, but this is a guess, so I don't know. Yes?
You spoke about full disk permissions a fair amount. I've noticed a lot of applications asking for it. They don't seem to require it. Do you know if any good community sort of aggregations of why, what are the implications? In some applications that's the asking for it. I'm guessing there's a benefit, but it's not clear. Any guidance on that?
So the question is that many applications ask for full disk access. I think it's actually not the application, it's oftentimes not the application asking for it, but they somehow do something that they show up in the privacy pane under the full disk access part that you can either grant or not grant that right. I usually just either don't grant or revoke all of them. So I have also the same issue. I have like, I think like 8 applications showing up in my full disk access requirement or table, and I just revoked it from all of them or didn't grant it at the first place. And so, for example, one of them was VMware, and I asked them, why do you ask for full disk access? And they came back surprised that we don't need it. So my guess is that many times it's somehow the system will automatically ask for it for some reason, because they might try to access something that requires full disk access, and then this database is populated. Like, for example, if we try similarly, if an application tries to access the desktop folder, then the system automatically will ask for desktop folder permission for the application itself. Yeah, just don't give full disk access to anything, really. So that's my rule. Even if you have to, like for terminal, because you do something with it that requires full disk access, for that time give it and then revoke. unless it's an endpoint security client. Yes.
So we've seen this theme where a bug is reported to Apple, it's kind of fixed, and then the onus, it seems, is almost on the security researcher to go validate it. A lot of times it's incomplete. As an outsider, as someone who reports a lot of bugs to Apple, do you have any suggestions of, hey, how do we get this right? Or how can the process be improved so it's not dragged out so long? It's a tough question.
Yeah, I think one way the process could be improved, although it doesn't scale, for more architectural changes, they could consult the finder if the fix is good enough or what the finder thinks about the fix, and then both Apple and the finder can think through or have a chance to think through of that fix if it's sufficient or not. But I think it also doesn't scale. Like there are, I don't know, 50, 60 bugs fixed in a single update. I think you cannot do this for every single bug. So for some, I would do it. I have no better idea. Any other questions? If not, then thank you and have a good lunch.